having. That was a joke. My name is John Holden. I'm president of the Edgewater Historical Society. I'm glad to see a nice full house here for our first program of 2025. Hard to believe a quarter century's already gone in this century. But we're really excited to have our speaker today, Ed Zotti. I'll say a few more words about him shortly, but has some other matters of business first. Wanted to see how many people are here for the first time for a EHS lecture. Okay, fair number. Thanks for coming out. How did you find out about it? On Facebook or?
Mailing list.
Mailing list? Yeah. Okay. We're delighted to have you. Oh my God, yeah, my friend Sarah, all the way from London, England.
Just for this presentation.
She's also a member of the press, long-term editor of Bloomberg News. So she's coming back to Chicago, an old friend of mine, and we're delighted to have her back. So, a few things. If you're not a member of the Edgewater Historical Society and would like to become one, we have a great introductory offer, $5 for the first year, and with that you'll get not only invites to all the great programs we do, but our quarterly newsletter, which I have right here. We have some extra copies of that on the back desk if you want to grab one on your way out the door. We are also happy to have a great lineup of programs already in the works for this year. Last year we did a record 8 programs. How many were here for a lot of them, or most of them? Great. Yeah, we had great programs, all very well attended like today. And we're really happy to provide a platform for all these wonderful resources we have in Chicago, like Ed Zotti. So, a couple other things. Our next program will be actually part of our annual meeting. I think it'll be here. There's a chance we might be doing it over at the former Trumbull School over at Foster and Ashland. But we have another great speaker lined up, Bonnie McDonald, the president of Landmarks Illinois, who's really been doing a lot of deep thinking and wrote a pretty interesting treatise, as it were, on the importance of preservation and the best ways to kind of navigate preservation of architecturally significant buildings. So we're really looking forward to that talk as well. Again, that'll be March 1st. In the interim, we have 2 other events. Our book club, which meets every other month when we're not doing a lecture program. We have our Chicago History Book Club. Next month, in conjunction with African American History Month, we'll be reading a book called Black on the Block. It's written by a Northwestern University professor who was involved in the urban renewal, as it were, of the North Kenwood neighborhood, and a lot of very interesting observations there. So there are copies of that book available if you're interested in being a part of that discussion group. You can check the book out from the library here today. And we have, again, copies at the back desk. Also, 2 weeks from today at 2 o'clock, EHS will be participating in a community forum on the city's proposal to dramatically upzone Broadway from Montrose up to Devon. This is, I think, a very controversial proposal that the city is pursuing, and we want to have a kind of a deep dive discussion on what's going to be involved in that. So that's going to be 2 weeks from today at 2 o'clock, and we encourage you to attend that as well. I also want to announce the results of our annual photo competition. We have the winning entries on display at the back table there. Killian's holding up the winning entries, but the focus of the of the photo contest this year was the windows of Edgewater, and we have 3 winners. The first place went to Gloria Evanson. I don't think we have Gloria with us today. And Steve Masick was the second place. Steve's not here to receive applause, but Demas Oliveira over here. So a round of applause for Demas. So thanks to everyone who participated in that. Margie, you got-
Where is the forum 2 weeks from now? Here?
it's right here, right here, 2 o'clock. Without further ado, let me introduce today's speaker, Ed Zotti. Ed is a lifelong Chicagoan. He's shared a great deal of history with the city of Chicago, and for many years he's was the principal advisor, editor, and personal trainer to Cecil Adams, who wrote the infamous, or is it notorious, Straight Dope column in the Chicago Reader. I think the Straight Dope column was to the Reader what Mike Royko was to any newspaper he wrote for. So a very witty column. Any Straight Dope fans? Let's ask Ed.
I don't find that many people around who even remember.
Hopefully Ed will pass his compliments on to Cecil for how well his work is still remembered. So Ed was a journalism major at Medill at Northwestern, and in addition to being a journalist, he's also something of a demographer and studied and worked in urban transportation planning. And he's really kind of a Renaissance man. He also wrote a wonderful book about rehabbing an old house. Maybe we could have him come back at some point and talk about that. It came out, what, 15 years ago, maybe?
2008.
2008, okay. So, boy, the years are flying by. That's still available for purchase. You can look it up on the internet. The Barn House by Ed Zotti. It's got a subtitle as well. It's Saving a Historic Treasure.
Confessions of an Urban Rehab.
There you go. Okay, and that house is located in the Ravenswood neighborhood, where Ed also still resides. Yeah. Okay. Very good. Let's see what else. Ed did a series of really compelling columns for the Chicago Sun-Times back in 2019 and 2020. I saved them all, being the pack rat hoarder that I am, and they really were eye-opening examinations as to what's going on demographically in the city of Chicago. This was as of 5 years ago, and let's see what's happened since 5 years ago. Yeah. COVID. Hard to believe that 5 years ago this month we first started getting inklings as to what was coming down the pike. So we all know it's had dramatic impact on the world, and the city of Chicago is no exception. So without further ado, let me turn the floor over to Ed and give him a round warm of applause.
So the first question I have is, can you guys read the screen with the lights partly down?
Yeah.
Make it totally dark. There's a lot of stuff in here. Okay, good. The second problem with what I didn't anticipate was, where do I stand and be able to see the screen and be able to talk to you at the same time?
Can you
So
speak more loudly, please?
I'm going to try. So I'm going to try and stand here and see how this works. Got my little pointer. Okay. So I am, as John mentioned, journalist, author, and data geek. I say that without a blush. And I find this stuff fascinating. And the fact that all of you people fill the house on a cold Saturday morning for a talk with the word demographic in the title makes me think you shared that enjoyment of it. You find it as fascinating as I do. So I guess we'll find out. So with that, let's talk about the impact of COVID. I'm going to broaden it out a little bit after I talk about COVID, but we'll start with this. You probably know that Chicago grew during the 2010s, including the white flight, which had been occurring for 60 years, ended during that decade. But since the pandemic, the population has dropped. Now, if you go onto the internet and Google Chicago population, you will get the numbers that I quote here, and they come off the Census Bureau's website. And it would lead you to think that the population has dropped by 82,000 over 5 years, which is a lot. But if you've been doing this for as long as I have, the numbers are suspicious because this number is taken from the decennial census, which was done by actual count theory. And this is taken from the American Community Survey, which is a survey. And they don't count everybody, they count a sample. And there's built-in sampling errors. And so the results you get from those two different data sets are similar, but they are not the same. And they are often off by tens of thousands. So the fact that it says 82,000 there is not a reliable number. Why did the census do it that way? Because it's government work, I guess. But also because during COVID in 2000, they couldn't conduct the survey to their satisfaction. So they didn't have comparable data. So they came up with the number they've got, close enough. However, we're into the business of exact science here. So what I did was I went back and I compared the 2013 data with the 2019 data, which preceded COVID when they had a good service. And there you see the results. The number, yeah. Let's get back. I'm a little fumbled. The population did go down, but probably only by about 30,000, not 80,000. The number of Hispanics and Asians went up, whites and blacks went down. Is 30,000 a reliable number? I don't know, but it's more reliable than 82,000. Still, it went down. It didn't go up. That's not a good thing. Question is, who left? And how bad off are we for their loss? I happen to know, because I've done a lot of work with this stuff, that college graduates as a class were a huge driver of change in Chicago and have been over the last 40 years, and specifically over the last, since 2010. So I thought it would be a good idea to look specifically at college graduates and see how their numbers change. Because if educated people are leaving Chicago, that's a really bad sign. To my delight, I found out that that wasn't the case. In fact, for all four of Chicago's major ethnic groups, Hispanics, non-Hispanic, whites, blacks, and Asians, the numbers of college graduates living in the city went up, in some cases substantially. Now, this is the numbers here I'm showing you are for the 2010s. You can see the numbers went up. We gained, during the 2010s, we gained about 200,000 college graduates. Big, big number. Between 2019 and 2023, somewhat to my surprise, I found the same result. The number of college graduates for all four major ethnic groups increased. Not necessarily a lot. Non-Hispanic whites only went up 5,000. Chicago, during the 2010s, was a major destination for people who graduated from universities in the Midwest, Big Ten schools in particular. At one point, this shows you what a geek I am, I went to LinkedIn, and you can do a data search for where people went to college. And Chicago was the major destination for people on LinkedIn, hundreds of thousands of people who reported where they went to school, of every city in the country, including New York. Now, is that true now? Well, it's calmed down. There's only 5,000 additional college graduates who were white who moved in during that 40 period. Nonetheless, this was COVID, and people continued to move in, which is pretty interesting all by itself. Also, even more interesting, the other three major ethnic groups, Hispanics, blacks, and Asians, also reported big gains. 23,000 additional college graduates, Hispanic, 20,000 black, 23,000, 22,000 Asians. Total increase, almost 90,000 during COVID, okay? People were bailing out of big cities. The number of college graduates increased. That's a striking fact. So who left? Well, we know the people who got college degrees went up. People without college degrees had to go down. And in fact, that's what happened. The number of, all four major ethnic groups saw declines. Now, admittedly, in Hispanics, it's a pretty trivial decline. But 40,000 whites, 36,000 blacks, 7,000 Asians left. Now, I'm not trying to be elitist about this. I'm not saying that people who don't get college degrees are unworthy individuals. I am sorry they left. I'm sorry we all had to go through COVID. However, the silver lining in this very dark cloud was the fact that the people who stayed were the most educated people. And their numbers increased substantially during one of the major crises of our lifetimes. It's a striking fact. The numbers, by the way, somebody here is probably going to add up the numbers and realize that they don't. And I've got an excuse, and I wrote it up there because somebody was going to have it. It's because this doesn't report every single data group and every single community. So, don't, off my case. So, the upshot was that Chicago, in COVID, oddly enough, left Chicago better educated. It actually worked out okay. Is that bizarre or what? The number of college graduates as a percentage in Chicago as of 2023, the last year available, rose to 45.7%, which is the highest of the 7 largest U.S. cities by a considerable margin, pulling away. More even than New York. Now, lest we all start patting ourselves on the back. The 8th largest city, San Diego, has 52%, so we've still got a ways to go. But still, considering we live in what was at one time an old factory town, the fact that we have the number of college graduates and it continues to rise, even during times of crisis, is a remarkable fact. So, I want to move on from the immediate crisis, which we have survived remarkably well, at least as far as the demographic aspect of it is concerned, to some of the trends that we saw over the long span. I've been here for a while, and I know what the long span is like, and I see a few gray hairs, and I know some of you have too. Some of those trends are, and I alluded to this, college graduates, the influx of college graduates has transformed this city in a multitude of ways, some just physical. The neighborhoods, a lot of the neighborhoods, I'm going to talk about that, have improved dramatically. 400,000 additional college graduates from 2000 to 2023. Can you guys see this okay? Yeah. As I said, white flight ended, which had been going on since 1950. It ended in 2010. The number of white people increased in Chicago, not a ton, but it did go up and not down. The reason it went up and not down is that the number of college graduates coming in exceeded, finally, the number of non-college graduates moving out. The city is more affluent, but an important point, it is still not a wealthy city by comparison to its suburbs. We have the median household income in Chicago is 83%. Of that for the metropolitan area as a whole. If you want to find the big money, they're out in the burbs. The Ken Griffins of the world are dealing as it is. So even though the city is more prosperous as it was, it belies the idea that we are a city of rich people. We can support any kind of financial burden that you might want to put on. It's wealthier than it was. It is still not wealthy. The black community has shrunk a lot, and it's continuing to shrink. It has declined. At one point in 1980, it was almost 1.2 million. Since then, it has declined by 440,000. And it wasn't just anybody. I did a lot of work on that. I have a whole different talk I can give you about the black community. The people who left overwhelmingly were middle class or went on to become middle class. Did they all move to Atlanta? Not necessarily all of them, but a lot of them moved to southern cities like Atlanta, Washington, D.C., which is actually a southern city, Tucson, Houston, Dallas. The middle class, the black middle class in those towns rose dramatically. The one in Chicago flatland. We are one of the few cities. Now, I went to the top 10 largest black metros in the country. Detroit and Chicago were at the end of the range. We were the outliers. The black middle class of both towns failed. And why did they fail? Racism probably was part of it, but what, the South is not racist? That's why black people left the South in the first place, because it was racist. Because of the loss of industrial jobs that have brought them here in the first place. The economy changed, and they followed the jobs. And went back to the South. It's great if you go, Atlanta, Georgia now is, without a doubt, the capital of black America. And a lot of the people who made it that way came from Chicago. It's a great thing for Atlanta. It's not a good thing for us. The city, however, is slowly becoming, I'm not going to say integrated, that would overstate the case. It is becoming less segregated than it was. It's about time. We'll see a little bit more about that later. And then, finally, and this is something I want to come back to a lot, for some, including I think many in this room, Chicago, or at least parts of Chicago, have become a city of choice. And what I mean by that is you're here because you want to be here. You had a choice. A lot of you went to college. You could have gone a lot of different places. You decided to come here, and this is where you would put down your roots. And that makes you different from what was typically the case 100 years ago, where you went to Chicago because you were an immigrant, you needed a job, there was factory jobs in Chicago, and the housing was cheap. You were here not because you loved big cities, but because it was convenient. You were a citizen, you were a city dweller of necessity, not a city dweller of choice. And the change that we have seen is that now, for many people, at least in many parts of town, excuse me, Chicago is a city of choice. Not everybody, but for a selected group of people. Yeah. Okay, so we get now into the delicate and controversial subject of gentrification. Or, if I want to pick a somewhat highfalutin term, late-stage urbanism. You've probably heard of late-stage capitalism. Why can't we have late-stage? Sounds a little classy. Edgewater is a case in point. There is no question that gentrification, in the sense that it's often used as a bad thing that drives up property values and you can't afford to live anymore, it happens. It doesn't always happen. And that's an important point that I'm going to do that. Edgewater, I would report to you, and you may argue with me about this, but from the numbers and from my experience in Edgewater, and I don't live in Edgewater, but I live close by, and I'm up there quite a bit, it's a neighborhood of choice, in my observation. People live here because they want to live here. For whatever reason. Maybe it's not necessarily a virtuous reason, maybe they just like the piracy on cars. But they want to live here, and they had the option to move someplace else, and they made that choice. So here we get into Ed's theory of urban change, which I'm going to give you the simplified version, but this is a narrative that you don't find much in the academic literature for reasons that frankly are somewhat mysterious. And you may argue with me, and don't do it like you would, but we can talk about that later. But there is a natural urban succession that occurs. It has been occurring for well over the entire history of Chicago. First, immigrants arrive and settle in big cities like Chicago or New York or Philadelphia, whatever, because the jobs are there and the housing is cheap. Once they start making a few bucks, eventually, the classic thing, they move up and out. They move to, they're typically in the inner city back in the old days. They move to better housing on the fringes of city, and ultimately they wind up in the suburbs. And then a new generation of immigrants moves in behind them. And we have seen this repeatedly in my own lifetime. Probably, I'm sure you have too. In the late stage urbanism, which I say with some embarrassment, but it's, I don't want to call it gentrification necessarily, a new variety of immigrant moves in, a well-educated immigrant, and they're not because they're not coming off the boat, but they're coming from someplace other than Chicago. They are immigrants in that sense. I did some calculation. It is probably the case that 90% of the college graduates living in Chicago now were not born within the city limits. I was born in Oak Park, Illinois. It was a mile and a half outside the city limits. Not a lot, but more than half were not even born in the state of Illinois. Something like 54%. A lot of them were born in the suburbs, downstate Illinois, wherever. But they had to make the choice. The 90% who had to move from someplace else moved to Chicago because they had a range of options and Chicago looked the best. And they have stuck it out. And that has made Chicago a very different place than it was when I was a kid. So you have city dwellers by choice. The fact is, when people, they take surveys, Gallup does these every 10 years or so, they ask people where they would like to live. And the winner, invariably, is the suburbs of a big city. And some like the rural, and some like small towns, and yada yada. And there's a non-trivial minority that like big cities. But the mainstream view is living in the suburbs is the best. You have the most room, you can get the kids to play in the backyard, yada yada, all the things you've heard about. There is a smaller, non-trivial number, but a smaller number who like the big cities. Sometimes they just want to come there for the fire season in their 20s, and sometimes, like me and I think many of you, they stick it out for their entire lives. The difference with this late stage crowd is that they're educated, typically, and they have more money. And so there's a change because, really, in the process, because of that. And there's a journalist called Aaron Hall, who's written a book about this called The Great Inversion, because people tend to, the inner city that formerly was synonymous with poverty, all the rest of the ills that we know about, is now the place that attracts people with a couple of bucks. And it's become the expensive part of town. It's completely changed the whole demographic look of big cities like Chicago. Not all cities experience this, but many do. And even some that were given up for lost, like Detroit, are starting to experience revitalization of their urban centers because some people just like it for whatever reason. The result is often gentrification, which I define as a sharp upturn in property values, but not always. And again, Edgewater is an example. So, I want to go through, this is the maps. Can you see these maps? Yeah. There's a lot of data crammed into it. I could spend hours on that, and wait, better not be good. Thanksgiving go with me. So I won't try and point out everything, but basically we've got 3 metrics that I have looked at over the years, starting in 1980. The first is the percentage of college graduates, and blue tends to be a higher number, and red is a lower number. So college graduates, percentage of college graduates versus the U.S. average. The median household income, blue is more affluent, red is way less affluent. And home value. Home values are high when it's blue, and they're low when it's red. And you can see in 1980, Chicago was a declining industrial town, to be quite blunt about it. You look here, there was college graduates along the lakefront. You've got Hyde Park down here. You've got UIC. Some on the fringe here, up on the north side and part of the south side. But that was really about it. Likewise, household income, the outlying parts of town, where the immigrants of yore wound up before they bailed for the burbs. Reasonably affluent, I wouldn't say wealthy, but they're reasonably affluent. North, south, southeast. A little bit on the lakefront, but not even that much there. Hyde Park, a little bit. Home values in the toilet, frankly. Again, not even on the south side at all. Really, a little tiny bit along the Gold Coast here, and then on the north side. That was a declining industrial town of 43 years ago. Things started moving up from there, but it was slow. You see here, we've got a few more college graduates, along the lakefront is pushing west from the lakefront, but still not a lot. Same deal. Still pretty low income. It's expanding a little bit. Lincoln Park, near north. But even near north, half of that was affluent. The other half was Cabrini, very impoverished area.
I can't read that well from here. Is this online somewhere? I'm jumping ahead.
This is not online. If you can't read this, we can put the lights out altogether.
It's small.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's small.
This is a lot. I apologize. It's just kind of hard to avoid. So I'm going to try. We can go back and look at this. Let me get through the whole thing right now. We can go back. If there's anything of interest you want to see, look in greater detail.
May I ask, just say what those three titles are. What are those three
This
graphs?
is percentage of college graduates versus the U.S. average. And if you've got color, that means you're ahead of the U.S. average. If you don't have any color, you're below the U.S. average. The household income, if you're blue, you're above the average for Cook County. If you've got red, particularly dark red, you're way below the average for Cook County. For home value, blue is above the average for Cook County, and red is below. That's the basic concept used all the way through. There's other ways to do it, but this was something I could do over time. Move with me so far? Okay. Again, things improved a little bit. You can see now that the area where college graduates live, in fact, a lot of college graduates, has noticeably expanded. We're going back in a couple of miles from the lakefront now. So that was a big change. Household income. Income tends to be a lagging indicator. It's sort of a geeky term. What I mean by that is it isn't the first thing to develop. And the reason for that, I think, is that college graduates come during what I call the big sorting, when they get out of school and they have to decide where they're going to live, where their first job is going to be, where they want to settle down. And when they do that, they have bright prospects, most of them, but they haven't making the big money yet. So they may show up and live out here in the neighborhood, but they're not making the kind of big money that's going to show up here yet. So this is a lagging indicator. If it starts, this area starts to get big in one census, in the next one, this is probably going to get bigger too. Home value is a little bit of a wild card, because you recall, I recall, because I was a homeowner back in the 90s, and to this day, property values shot up starting in the mid-90s. For a variety of reasons I won't go into, it just became popular to live in the city. And throughout a surprisingly large area, property values rose. Was it a bubble? Yes, it was a bubble. But you can see what it was looking like here as of 2000, and it continued until the crash in 2010. Now we're starting to really rock and roll. A college, the college town area is getting to be really huge and extending down to the South Lakefront. The South Lakefront historically has been an impoverished area that has lost tens of thousands of people and dwellings. There are vacant lots all over the place. But nonetheless, as of 2010, people were starting to move back. It hadn't amounted to anything too dramatic, but you can see the beginnings of it starting here. Now, Hyde Park was there, so they had that to begin with, but it was starting to happen. The income, like remember what I said, 10 years previously in 2000, this whole area had a lot of college graduates moving into, and now 10 years later, they're making some money, and that shows up in the census. And as I say, the property values, particularly in the place where people with big money are, but even in sort of what had been the working class parts of the Northwest Side, were rising a lot. 2023, the most recent data we have. Now, the area where college graduates live by preference is a huge area. I'm going to talk a little bit more about this, I don't want to spend too much time on that. But it is a major factor in the economy of Chicago. The household income, likewise, is remarkably high. A huge area. This comes in as far as Western Avenue, Kenzie, Pulaski, places that were, you know, they were in pretty bad shape when I was a kid. And now, I mean, there's obviously a difference between what it looks like in Lincoln Park and what it looks like out in Edgewater. But they are all on the see a major and sustained intake of college graduates over time. And property values are high all the way down here to 47. 47. Now, I'll pause here to note that is gentrification occurring? You bet. You can't really see this well, but the black squares here, the census tracts, the little data units that they use, are 200% of the county average. You can argue about what, and I look at gentrification as primarily a complaint about it's too expensive to live here. So my marker for gentrification is the property values. There's other things you could look at, I understand that, but it's simple to do it this way.
Can I just note, can you say anything about, it looks like the pocket on the median home value up around Edgewater is actually much lower. It's yellow.
Yeah, I'm going to come back to that. I thought somebody might pick up on it. Yes, and that's why Chicago is a great example of what I'm talking about. A neighborhood of choice. People, there are some, obviously some beautiful homes in Edgewater. There are some expensive sections. They're not as crazy expensive as Lincoln Park, but nonetheless, on the whole, property values in Edgewater and also in Rogers Park, West Rogers Park, are really not that high. You know, in some cases, they're actually kind of low. Nonetheless, they have a high percentage of college graduates. People aren't living in Edgewater, I don't think, maybe you'll tell me this, or Rogers Park, because they're surrounded by their fellow rich people. They just like it there. Why do they like it? God only knows. I personally, I find Edgewater charming. I just like to walk around. I think it's a cool neighborhood. There's all kinds of interesting streets. Got interesting little stores. I go to the Gethsemane Garden Center, yada yada. You name it. It's a
the Edgewater Historical Society?
The Edgewater, that's
Andersonville?
Andersonville. There's a lot of cool stuff in the Edgewater. I mean, there's people, cool people. I don't want to. You meet people you don't meet in the suburbs. That's the excuse that I. So I'm going to come back to this, but this you can see this is where we are today, and it's a continuing process. Where are we going to be in 2030, 2040? No idea. But if things continue at this rate, Chicago will be a dramatically different place. One of the things I point out was that if Chicago is now getting close to 46% college graduates, within this decade, if it keeps up at this rate, it is almost certain that it will be more than half college graduates before 2030 arrives. Something magic happened then? No. But that's a pretty striking change, considering what Chicago started out as 40, 50 years ago. So, if you're looking at that, and let's go back and take a look at it. So we've got a lot of college graduates here. That looks great. Well, what about the rest of this? Not so much. A little bit. I mean, here we have Beverly.
Morgan
Beverly
Park.
and Morgan Park,
Yeah.
which have been stable for a long time, but in the middle, not so much. Likewise, the income is low and the property value is low. So, does that mean the expression you've heard, Chicago, great, it's doing great some places, but it's 1/3 New York and 2/3 Detroit. I know the guy who originated that expression, by the way. Nice guy. My answer is not really. You often hear it said that Chicago has lost its middle class, not just in the black community, which is certainly the case, but in general. If you look at the numbers, it is the case that the middle class in Chicago has shrunk somewhat, but it still remains a pretty dominant part of the scene. In 2000, 1% of Chicagoans were high income. 69% middle income, 30% low, which is, the ideal. There's other ways to look at this. The booking institution says it ought to be 20 high, 60 middle, and 20 low. So 69 middle is pretty good. Now, if that has shrunk somewhat in 2020, 63% in middle income, 32 low, so that had gone, and 6% high income. So the extremes have gained, but it has not made a dramatic change. It is not the case that the middle class, all ethnic groups, has bailed out of Chicago. It's just not true. It is, however, and this is an important point, Chicago is wealthier than it was. It is not wealthy by comparison to its suburbs. 83%, median household income in the city of Chicago is only 83% of the metro area. If you want to get the big bucks, you still got to go up to the North Shore. It is the case, however, that much of the city has shifted from lower middle class to upper middle class. How you define those things is a question for there's some discussion. Nonetheless, people are making a pretty good buck. And there are but 6% of billionaires. I'm not aware. But on the whole, people are doing way better than they were. It is still not a rich city in the sense that people think they understand that. So, let's talk a little bit about what has driven all of this change. And really, it has been college graduates who have made this area here what I'm going to call, these are, I wouldn't call it the gentrified part of Chicago because not all of it, including Edgewater, is an expensive place to buy or rent a home. It is, however, a place where their college graduates are a very large percentage of the people who live there. And this area here, I'm going to say this makes up what I'm calling neighborhoods of choice. And what I mean by that is people live there because they want to. And why do they want to? It varies. And like I said, maybe they like the varsity, maybe they like the fact that they get to come to the Historical Society and listen to talks like myself. But for whatever reason, they're there and they stay there. It used to be the case people would say, well, they show up in their 20s and they go to bars and they get drunk and then they get there and go to the... And some of them do that, but not all. It's increasingly the case, and you can see this in the school data and all the rest of the stuff, which I'm not going to show you. A lot of them stick it out for the long haul. They tend to cluster. This is not a random collection here. It isn't scattered all over the place. It's largely a contiguous area. It's a characteristic of this. And why are they there? Because of amenities. The original amenity in Chicago, obviously, is the lake. The fact that the lake has been there all this time and some of the fanciest housing is itself an amenity. Some of the classiest housing, an example here is, this is Beverly Morgan Park, built around the Blue Island Moraine, which is a bunch of hills. It's a pretty area, and it's got some very nice housing. And that, I would put forth to you, is the reason that the area has stayed as prosperous as it has for as long as it has. It's got nice housing in a pretty area. It's an amenity. The fact that people have moved in and patronize a nice collection of restaurants and all is itself an amenity. And that, I think, is the main reason that the area grows continuously. You can't afford to live in Lincoln Park, so you move to the part of the area that you can live in. I did that myself. We priced out Lincoln Park when we were looking at houses, and they were crazy money. We moved up to Lakeview, which was, I'm technically in Lakeview, believe it or not, what we call it Lakeview. It was way cheaper. We had to buy an old dump, fix it up. It has improved around me, but that's why this area has spread the way it has. That's a characteristic. These all, I would say, are people, like I say, they are neighborhoods of choice. People want to live there. It accounts for, and this gets to the point that I'm trying to, only 35% of the land area, but more than half of the population of the entire city is substantially denser. 16,000 residents per square mile, 9,000 to the
Edgewater is 50,000 per square miles. Edgewater is 50,000 per square.
There you go. It varies quite a bit. Downtown, you know, in the north side is a lot higher. It is also, and this gets to an important point that I think Edgewater is a good example of. It is demographically stable. It is diverse, at least by Chicago standards. It ain't saying a lot, I understand that, and it is sometimes, but not always, wealthy. So I want to go through this quick. This is the same data set on the far left here. I just want to be able to compare them to the other two things which are new, I think is helpful. So we've got, this is the college thing, you've seen this before. Here we've got, and this I apologize, this is kind of hard to read at this scale in the lighting we have. This shows we've got racial and ethnic distribution. The darker colors are, the darker the color, the more segregated it is. Dark green is more than 90% white. In 1980, that was a big chunk of the northwest side, big chunk of the southwest side. 90% blue, blue here, dark blue means 90% black. Big chunk of the west side, really big chunk of the south side. Sharp division between the two, particularly striking on the south side. Western Avenue, as in 1980, you probably heard about the shifting of that boundary over time, was Western Avenue. The east side of Western Avenue, 90% black. The west side, 90% white. And the numbers would change in 10 years. I'm somebody who lived on the west side growing up. I've been honest. A little over 10 years, my neighborhood went from probably 95, 98% white to more than 90% white. There you have the turnover. That was still occurring down here. Median household income, now I've divided it, it's the same basic number for income left, but I've divided it a different way. Now blue means, dark blue means it's 200% of the county average. Blue, which is means pretty wealthy. Blue means it's above, it's in the middle income range. And I have to get a little geeky here. One of the ways, it isn't the only way, but one of the ways to define middle class income now is 2/3 up to double the median income for the county. Now that's a little geeky, but what that means in the case of Chicago, I figured it out the other day, it's something like $56,000 to $177,000 annually. And if you're making $177,000, you're doing pretty good, and you're doing better than somebody at the low end of the range, but you're still, by any reasonable understanding of the term, from lower middle class at one end to upper middle class at the other, you're not really rich. If you're making $500,000, you're rich in my way. So that's how you define it. You think it's a pretty broad range, but it's a pretty reasonable range when you think about it. And that's what we see here. If you're in the yellow, that's the area that is below that 2/3 cutoff. And that's the low income area. And if you're in the black, of which there was none in 1980 in Chicago, that's the upper income. I'll go through this quickly. It changes over time. Here, as you can see, the college gets more expensive. The degree of segregation in Chicago gradually subsides. You notice it most strikingly, in the north side, northwest side, which gradually was down to the upper 75, which was still a lot. Not so much in the black community, which remained largely segregated up until surprisingly late in the day. Maybe not so surprising. Meanwhile, there's the demographics, the middle income area, the center of the city, the urban inner city as of 1990 was still pretty much low. 2000, that begins to change. Now you see in the center of the city, what used to be the inner city, the near west side, for example, it's starting to become part of the middle income area. In the degree of segregation in the white community is noticeably diminished. A little bit, not so much in the black community. In fact, it's starting to expand into what the area that formerly was solidly white is now mixed income. And that in Chicago, as you know, is a short period from when from the first white person moves out till when the last white person moves out. And I take this as true. That's probably what was going on on the south side. 2010, again, the trend continues. A lot more college graduates. Now here's where I want to start taking a look at Edgewater specifically. Edgewater is in Rogers Park in West Wisconsin. If it's yellow, you can see there's yellow here. That is no ethnic group predominates. No ethnic group has more than 50% of people who live there. And that's often a temporary condition while a neighborhood transitions from all of one thing to all of something else, but not on the north side. This condition persists over long periods of time. Hold the question till I'm almost done with what I'm saying. And I think that has been a characteristic of neighborhoods of choice in general. I'm not saying they're all integrated. Lincoln Park here, although they have become more so. Lincoln Park is more than 70%, 75% white. There are no parts of it left that are 90%, and the parts that are 75% white are declining. It is becoming, I'm not saying it's the promised land, I'm saying it's becoming more integrated in its form. Likewise, household income is spreading the north side in general and much of the near west side, pretty affluent. Still a lot of poverty, low income area in the, let's be blunt here, black neighborhoods on the west side and also on the south side. 2023 is today, as you can see, like I say, massive increases in the size of the part of town where a lot of college graduates live. The thing I'm going to point out the most, however, is two things. One is that the ethnic mix in the north side, far north side, has been pretty stable. There have been dramatic changes elsewhere. On the west side, Hispanics are replacing black people on the west side. On the southwest side, Hispanics are replacing white people. You see dramatic changes over a period of only 10 years. You don't see that in neighborhoods of choice. People don't vote. It's much more resilient. There are no doubt challenges. There's crime, as you know, in Rogers Park, but it doesn't make people panic and want to move out on the next bus. They stick it out. People have been worried about Rogers Park my entire life. Rogers Park has been surprisingly stable that entire time. Likewise, Edgewater, you probably got a few stories, but it has been remarkably stable. There have been no huge demographic shifts noticeable, unlike many other parts of the city that are not choice neighborhoods. And that is the big distinction to draw. You have choice neighborhoods which tend to be characterized by a lot of college graduates, but not all. I mean, if it's 45% that have, 55% don't. A lot of people who don't like living in the city, but they are a marker, and they are a reliable marker. And once they become neighborhoods of choice, the evidence so far is that they stay there for a long time. So what do we deduce from all this? And now, I know you guys, it's been a long time. Besides picking some. First of all, we got through COVID on the whole just fine. Wish it didn't happen, but you know what? It turned out okay for us. The south side, I mentioned this, the South Lakefront is starting to come back. I didn't have to take time to point it out because we've been running so long. But in the 2010s, see the beginnings noticeably of a substantial increase in population, housing construction, lesser extent in income, but it's clearly a neighborhood, an area which stretches from the south all the way down to the South Shore, which was in really, really bad shape. Massive losses. More than anywhere else in the city, entire vacant lots, entire blocks were vacant lots. It is coming back, tens of thousands of dwellings were constructed. That's on the way down. The interior neighborhoods, the rest of the south side, not so good. The black middle class continues to grow, and that's a big issue. On the north side, prices are getting pretty catastrophic, and that's eventually going to be a problem even in Edgewater. And I'm sure there are some neighborhoods like in Andersonville, which are pretty pricey right now. But it's going to continue to be a challenge. Nonetheless, there is still the potential, there is still room for the city to grow in terms of finding a place. If you want to live in the city and you might have to buy a fixer-up or something like that, you still have the opportunity to do that. Edgewater is starting to get to the point where it's getting pretty expensive, I understand it. But there is, and it's going to be something that as time goes on, development is going to push farther north, but people are going to get priced out of the neighborhoods farther south. And that's going to be something that we're going to have to deal with affordable housing discussion for another day. Now, the good side about this, and I think the main takeaway here is, despite the problems we have, Chicago is way more resilient than it was 50 years ago. And I mean that in a very basic way. People don't cut and run the first time they get itchy about something is going on. A black person moved in 5 miles away from me. Oh my God, there goes the neighborhood. I gotta move out now. That was kind of the attitude. In the neighborhood, my experience, I mean, my parents moved on up because Oak Park, where they moved like almost about my years, was a nicer neighborhood. You know, we got a bigger house, bigger yard, yada yada. Nonetheless, they weren't rooted where they weren't in the west side of Chicago, because that's really where they wanted to be. It was just cheap housing, it's a train line going down the other way. Now people are here and have made their choice, and they're going to do, I mean, there's a limit beyond which they won't, but they will do what they need to do to keep the neighborhood going. They will try to solve the problem. Rogers Park is an excellent example of that. The city is more affluent, it's still not wealthy, and we need to keep those college grads coming, because they're what's driving the chains, and I am 100% sure they're going to continue to be the main driver. So, questions?
First of all, my parents were the
Outside voice. Loud.
Louder.
First of all, my parents were the OGs of gentrification, with the beat generation coming into Old Town in the 50s. We lived around every race. My grammar school's always, and I'm pretty old, you know, so I've always lived around integration. You knocked down the projects. Old Town Cabrini Green went to the suburbs. Taylor Homes, that's 50,000 people in the projects moving out. I don't know if that influences the data. People don't move into neighborhoods because they want to, it's the price. And they are being pushed out here at Edgewater. I don't know if we need more college grads, we need family housing. So that's my 2 cents.
I'm not trying to present the case that Edgewater is the promised land of everything. There is no question that people get, some people leave because they like this other, some people leave because they can't afford it, or they get pushed out of there.
Yes.
I was a victim of
They've always
gentrification.
been pushed out from Old Town, from New Town, and I know they're not being pushed out of Edgewater. We lost Puerto Ricans, and you know, they went to West.
It occurs, there's no argument. I will say, there are two sides to that coin. My neighborhood, my next door neighbors, preceded me by about 10 years, Hispanic family, bought a house and bought a two-flat. And they have experienced, last time I figured out, 700% appreciation. They, you know, the patriarch of the family died. One of his lifetime proud achievements was bestowing this piece of wealth upon his descendants. He had made an investment.
Intergenerational wealth.
Yes.
But Logan Square, they also gave money to Puerto Ricans that were pushed out of Old Town. So, you know, it's, yes.
It's a long argument. I don't want to get into it too much. There is certainly some gentrification in the bad sense of the term going on. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, we're looking at a proposal to upzone all of Broadway, coming from the Department of Planning, and it go all the way from Devon to Montrose. And the argument supporting it is we're going to get more affordable housing by having denser, taller buildings up and down Broadway. So my question to you, and we're going to have a forum on this 2 weeks from now in this very room.
We made announcements about it before you got here.
But the question I have then is, have you found in your research any correlation between higher density in the city and lower rents, lower property values?
I haven't looked specifically at that. I've had a lot of discussion with people about that. It's occurring, we haven't had that proposal, but it has certainly occurred to me as somebody who looks at transit a lot, that corridor is right for redevelopment. It would support, got a rail line running down it. It would support a whole lot more people purely on the practical level of transportation. Now, when the housing gets built, is it left entirely to the private market? Is it going to be cheap housing? New construction is never cheap. It's just what it costs to build this stuff. You've got to make enough money on a project to be able to afford to build it. It increases the pool of property that exists, and over time, as it ages, it will become part of the affordable housing structure, the pool in time. It won't happen immediately. To deal with the immediate problem, which is a problem, you need to build in something to maintain, at least for a while, affordable housing. We're having that discussion in the 47th Ward where I live on Irving Park Road, where there's a lot of interest in building, not skyscrapers, but like 7, 8, 5 to 8 story buildings. And you need to build in affordable housing, not because you expect to get people who are very poor, but just to people at the lower end of the middle income range. A school teacher, school teachers may have been a good like this. But somebody who's looking at a not-for-profit or something like that. They're probably people who would like to live there if they could, they just can't afford it, and maybe affordable housing. So I think there needs to be some conscious provision. It can't be left to private.
Isn't it true that if you look at your data, that the densest neighborhoods, the highest property values are in the densest neighborhoods, not in those that are less dense?
In Chicago, as a general proposition, the neighborhoods of choice are substantially, almost double the density. Now, it varies a lot. I mean, there's toward the center of the city, it's zoned for more density. You're naturally going to get a whole lot more. So there's a cause and effect relationship. But it's a complicated subject. We can discuss it. I don't want to spend all the... Yes, sir.
So I was wondering, you laid things out racially, income-wise, college graduate-wise, and analyzed that. I wonder about geographically in the neighborhood. One of the things I observed is the neighborhoods, the communities that are growing, and the communities that are not, regardless of all that stuff. And what I want to say is when you look at those, there's large swaths of the city across the south and west side, where I'm sure the population over that time period is just down, 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 declining population.
Right.
And less people live there, and when we talk about the black population, we know that it's basically the middle class black population that's moving out, and the community that gets left behind is the lowest class, most unable to move, racially segregated bunch. But so my question is, as parts of the city, as those communities become or have become unlivable, so to speak, when they've been vacated and people that the demand in the city is focused on the other communities of choice, the more livable neighborhoods. And I think that in this whole conversation about gentrification and demand and so forth, have you looked at how important is it to make those inner city, basically black communities, make them livable and attractive to other people to come in to kind of smooth out the demand across the city?
It's very important, and you raise a topic, it's an excellent topic, it's a talk by itself. I will say that one of the, people might not think of it as a positive development, but one of the positive developments on the west side in particular, which I've seen is, let's be blunt, the black community on the west side is noticeably contracting. Remember I said 440,000 black people now. A lot of them came out of the west side, and you can see it on the maps. That's a choice. They made a choice. The middle class black people who went to Atlanta improved their lives. It was bad for us. It was good for them. It is not a tragedy. What is happening though, which did not used to happen, is people are moving in behind them, primarily Hispanics. You see that in Austin where I grew up. The north end of Austin has become noticeably more Latino. There's more, they are relatively, the home is relatively inexpensive, they are relatively intact. The crime situation is not great.
So I'd love to see you analyze that, because I know there's other communities, like black communities, that where the blacks haven't been replaced by Hispanics, they've just emptied out.
They empty out.
Right.
And in fact, to some extent, that's been happening in
Washington Park, Chatham,
Washington Park is
Englewood.
a different stuff. Talking about a little different, but what's the, now I'm blanking on.
Woodlawn,
No.
Englewood?
Englewood and West Englewood. But in the last census, you could see that it was becoming more diverse because of Hispanics moving in.
Okay.
That's one of the toughest neighborhoods around. Garfield Park, West Garfield Park, East Garfield Park. There you see people moving in, and that is a tough neighborhood. And I don't want to get into a big discussion about Garfield Park, but there is an entrenched drug culture there. It is a dangerous place. So that's going to be a real tough call. But it's going to have to happen, and it undoubtedly will happen. It'll take a lot of effort. Yes. Yes.
I'm sorry. Could I just jump back to the COVID data you looked at? So you described the non-college graduates as moving out, but we know that from the research that's been done that lower income people died in greater numbers during COVID than higher income people. That income does, you said there's a lag, but it does, correlate with education to some degree. So I'm kind of curious if you looked at mortality data at all to see how many of those people actually moved out and how many of them were carried out.
The census data was my primary source here. It doesn't let you get into that level of detail. It's an interesting point. It would take a really deep dive by somebody with way more expertise than I have to get to the bottom of that. You don't really know where they went. You know they're not going out. That's what Wall Street. Yes.
You would have to quick point, you would have to cross-reference that with the mortality tables from the county.
It's probably gettable, that kind of information, but you have to see your
Good research project for a college student.
Somebody here. Yes, sir.
So we've lost 1 million or so people since our peak population in our history. Did we lose more to the suburbs or more to Atlanta? Are we losing them to other states, or are we losing them to the suburbs?
There is a way to track that. I know a guy, there's inter-county, flows of population, and it doesn't go back to the 1950s, I don't think so. It is certainly the case that Atlanta is not the only. I don't want to accept everybody from Chicago going to Atlanta. We have been one of the major recipients, but so have many. So is Indiana. So is the Twin Cities. And there's a lot of places they go to where things are materially better for them, or at least they think they are, than in Chicago. Yes.
With the incoming Trump administration talking about tariffs and other tax changes, what is the urban landscape going to look like in a couple, 3 years?
This is not going to win me any friends to say this, but from a standpoint of demographics, the 2010s, which Obama was in the first half and Trump was the second half, no noticeable difference between those two administrations. And on the whole, they were very prosperous times. I mean, if you go between the 2010 and the 2013, 2023 mass, striking difference. I mean, that area with the college graduates living is massively improved. It is hard to make, and believe me, I did not vote for that guy. Never did. I voted for a Mickey Mouse, right? But it doesn't have any the economy doing well. And maybe it did well because it was boosted by ridiculously bad tax cuts that benefited the wrong class of people. Nonetheless, purely from an economic standpoint, it was a pretty good period. And that's one of the reasons maybe why that guy won, because people remembered it as a good time. I don't want to make any predictions. I am not that smart. It's not necessarily, I don't say it's going to be a great period of time. It's not necessarily going to be a catastrophe. That's all I'm saying. Yes.
The old U.S. Steel site where they proposed many things might have a proposal that's going to work now. That neighborhood has been decimated. Will that bring that neighborhood up if it comes to fruition?
You're talking about the computing, the quantum
Yes,
computing
yes.
center? I don't think so. It's basically a building full of massive technology. It doesn't need 10,000 steelworkers to make it go. So I don't see that as being a major driver of change. It's cool. The fact is, in fact, I'm a transit guy, and one of the things I have been proposing is that, I won't go into too much detail, but is to serve that site with transit because there's an unused, little used rail line that runs past it. I think it is potentially something that would cause people to move to Chicago in general, because they want to be in research, and there's research assistance and grants, and there's a whole sort of ecosystem built around that. Are they going to live on that site? I doubt it. But they might live in Hyde Park, or they might live on the south side someplace. So I think it's not a bad thing.
South Shore?
You don't know. I mean, so yes.
Okay, so I know that we didn't talk very much about Edgewater at all. So for those who are interested in Edgewater data, we have the Edgewater data at least through 2010 on our website. Marsha Holland did an excellent job putting it up and doing all this research. And so how you find it, it's go to our website, edgewaterhistory.org, and under local history, select census, which will be on the left-hand side. And there's data for each of the census going back to 1930.
And as soon as we figure out how to get the 2020 data.
Maybe you can help us on that. We'll talk about that later. The other thing is a comment. So when we talk about Edgewater, it's somewhat distinct because there's different parts of Edgewater that are quite different from each other. So you have the high rises on the lake, primarily on the east side. And then you have Kenmore and Winthrop, which is quite different from Sheridan Road and quite different from Western Broadway. So you really have three Edgewaters, so to speak.
My point, and I thought I mentioned quite a bit about Edgewater. It is certainly the case that it is a very diverse, and you can see that in the data, very clear. A very diverse area in terms of economics and demographics and so on. And people are okay with that. Do they really love that? Maybe some of them do. Maybe some of them don't. But they don't all move away because they're afraid. Yes.
Yeah, one thing you didn't bring up, which is prominent in the Edgewater's demographic history, is the percentage of foreign-born population, which reached a height of 36%, I think, when we're on 1960 or 1950. We were constantly, if you study, it goes through constantly changing shifts of immigrant and refugee groups coming to Edgewater. But the percentage of population of foreign-born is hard to find now because they used to be very granular up until 2010, and now it's hard to find that data. Do you have any idea of how we could take a closer look at that with either the ACS or the GAP?
I haven't had to get way into the weeds with that. I haven't spent a lot of time. I have seen the data in older censuses that kept into, the number of people immigrating from Trinidad and Tobago, that kind of 6. I don't know, but I haven't looked. They may have discontinued that in later periods of time. It was a very, not that there's any lack of random access memory in the United States, but it's a very data-intensive thing to collect all that stuff.
Well, there's even a classification called born at sea. And we had a few back in 2010.
The thing it's sufficient for my purposes to make the point that these massive shifts of demographic, population occurs at a pretty macro level. Hispanics are an easily tracked group, and you can see that in the data that I have, how it just shifts over time. So the point in general is I think, well established. Getting into the fine detail of how many come from Lithuania, that's a little tougher to do. And it used to be done quite deep. I mean, I remember
that. Great. They had really good data.
There was. I mean, I remember stuff back in the 50s and 60s that went into incredible detail. Is that tougher to do now? Yeah, probably. Yes.
You kept the statement you made about what was wrong with the 2020 census data versus the community survey data.
Well, I think it was just, they took the surveys. The surveys conducted every year, even in the Senate years. But the returns were terrible, they couldn't get out, they couldn't follow, they had a lot of problems. They looked at the data they collected and decided, we cannot publish this. This is not up to our standards. So they skipped 2020. It goes, if you look at the list on the census gives, it goes from 19 to 2021. That's why I had to go compare 23 to 19. It was just, I mean, I'm glad they didn't publish bad data. It does complicate some of the calculations about what COVID actually do.
So the question, I guess, is like, the population via the census was higher. The community center was lower. What drives the difference?
Yeah, when you see, it's kind of built in. I mean, they're different, like I said, they're different methods of collection. They've always been. There was a somewhat larger difference during the decennial number. We didn't really have a 2020 ACS number, but it didn't quite mesh up. It was more striking difference than you usually get. I don't really know. I got to think it's partly because they had problems with COVID, getting good data, and even some stuff that they got that they did publish maybe wasn't as reliable as it could be. I don't know. But I agree, it's more different than one would have expected it to be.
I got a question, and I just want to make a plug also. Ed, do you know how many articles you did for the Sun-Times back in 1920? I got 10 in my folder here.
It's 20 or so.
20 or so. It's really good reading. I mean, if you want to go online and look up some of this material, I highly recommend it. I mean, obviously, we've gotten a bit of an update. One of my questions to you is there any plans for another series of stories in the Sun-Times or any other local publication?
But sometimes when I got through with them, God bless it, sometimes they gave me big chunks of space. They let me do my thing. I think they said, okay, we got it, we're done. You covered your entire lifetime data.
Well, you also had great stuff, I think, with Rob Carell as well, Cranes, and I'm trying to find that stuff.
We have written a lot of things. I'm working with Rob now.
Okay.
Another project.
We had Rob here 5 years
There's a little
ago.
mafia that works together on this stuff.
So a few questions I have. I'm also a lifelong Chicagoan. There's been obviously a lot of changes in my lifetime as well, and I was from that Auburn Gresham neighborhood that was probably the most rapidly resegregated community in the country. I've been told within a few months, went from all white to all black in 1973. There are a few things kind of coming up through the weeds. My general observation though is I think Hispanics kind of are acting like traditional immigrant groups. A lot of them were first generation in the city, and as soon as, like you referenced, they get a little stakehold or get a little intergenerational wealth, they're frequently moving out to the suburbs. And I think in the last 20 years, a lot of immigrants never even came into the city. They went directly to the suburbs. I think that's also true.
The massive growth in Hispanic population is in the suburbs.
Is in the suburbs. I'm wondering if anything is bubbling up through the census data now on the 50,000 Venezuelans and other refugees who came to Chicago, and whether they're staying. I've seen very little reporting on this.
It's too early for that data to be reported, and there is one time when you're going to want to look at the Venezuela, if you can. One thing that has to be said that will have a bearing on Chicago with the current administration, if they, honest to God, really cut down substantially on immigration and even legal immigration, that will have a major impact on Chicago, because Chicago historically has, we lose a lot of people because it's cold weather. It's not Canada, right? If we don't have anybody replacing the people that move out for whatever reason they move out, we're going to have a problem. The reason we are in as good a shape as we are now, as such as it is that we had a massive influx of Hispanics in the 90s. 200,000 Hispanic families, primarily from Mexico, moved to Chicago. And that really is the backbone of much of the working class in Chicago today.
And on the other side of the income spectrum, I don't know if the recent plunge in super high-end condo values is any indicator of whether that 6% wealthy number is on its way down. Obviously, we know Ken Griffith got out of town. Lots of stories about these condos that were selling for $5 million 7, 8 years ago, now going for maybe half that
I think
price.
the number of billionaires comes with so, but I don't know. I mean, downtown is a whole separate talk. it clearly needs to get, we were getting a lot of tourists, people who didn't live here at all. And that was a major part of the economy, and that just went away. And you need to get that back up. It puts a lot of people at work. You need to, somehow, it needs to become cool for college graduates at Ohio State and wherever else to want to move to Chicago. Right now I'm thinking, I don't know about Chicago, it's kind of dangerous now, so that's a problem.
One funny thing about me, every one of my friends growing up in the city lives in the suburbs. All my friends in the city now came from mainly other states.
Well, that's exactly my experience, and I think a lot of people would say the same thing. Yes?
Hi, I don't mean to say anything, but I just want to say, I was a census taker in this neighborhood, and we didn't get into, I got into 2 buildings on Sheridan Road, so if they didn't
Is this in 2000?
20,000, 2020. And all over Chicago, if they didn't send in their card, they probably weren't counted.
It was about.
All of Sheridan Road.
It's getting pretty close to moving. Let's talk a couple of more. Yes, sir.
Have you seen a breakout of non-American blacks versus, so like as far as the migration and like moving up in wealth and stuff like that?
I have not personally looked into it. Could I do that? I mean, could I track for locations for that? The numbers are probably there, but I haven't looked at it myself.
Well, I'm just thinking about Africans that I work with, how it's a lot different than black Americans.
There's a whole different experience. It's an interesting subject. I've done a fair amount of work looking at the demographics of the black community. I haven't gotten into the level of separating out people from Nigeria, sort of like happening part of that personal place. But it's a very interesting subject. A couple of more real quick. Yes.
I just had a question about the 83% number you were using a lot, comparing Chicago income to the suburbs.
Yeah.
How does that compare to other major cities? Because I would imagine suburbs typically are more wealthy.
It varies a lot. I read a story, it's been a long time ago, but Chicago, older industrial cities tend to be like Chicago in the sense that they are less affluent than the suburbs. Newer cities, I'm not sure, I don't want to quote any, but cities in the West, where, I think an example, I'm not sure about this, but Dallas, for example, I think Texas cities are able to aggregate, annex property with a great deal. It's much easier here than it is in Illinois or these cities. And because
They're doing there what we did 100 years ago.
Exactly. And because of that, all of the prospering suburbs get amalgamated into what they've got. And so I am not sure, but there are some cities where it's either at parity with the burbs or a little bit higher. And in those kinds of cities, the places that are in the burbs are way out there, and they're in the sticks. And those property values are low. It's an administrative function too. Yes.
When they count income, are they counting distributions from retirement plans? Because we have a lot of seniors, especially around Sheridan Road. It's probably a big chunk of it.
It's probably going off of IRS data, so I would guess yes.
I gotta think it's included. I think that's.
Yeah.
Anybody's not going to question.
Yeah, I just, a quick question, is there any data on people moving from the suburbs back into the city?
Like Lori.
Yeah, like me.
Well,
welcome to Edgewater.
There is data and I don't have it, I know people who collect it, inter-county. So if you move from DuPage to Cook, that probably would get counted some. Within Cook, not so much. And I came up with my 90% number, mainly on the basis of, the foreign-born, if you move from a different state, the census counts that. If you move within the state, they don't count that. But if you make the assumption, which I think is reasonable, that based on the population of downstate versus suburban Chicago versus Chicago proper, and what kinds of, what likelihoods of people are they, making moves within that group, you come up with the 90%, which I think is pretty defensible.
We have one last question over here, and then if I could ask the audience to stay put right after the question, we get a picture of Ed with the audience behind him.
And thank you for a great presentation. First of all.
number of years ago, the Knight Foundation sponsored the Soul of the Community research. And so I'm curious about what we know really drilling down about what it means to be a neighborhood of choice. In other words, we can guess at what that means to different people, but do we really know? And to what degree is diversity a factor? To what degree is historical, architectural preservation a factor, etc.? Has research been done that you're aware of that really
You can't get at that. You can't hear into people's souls through the census data. And is it possible to do it? You could probably conduct surveys and stuff, but it would be a very labor intensive.
There have been studies showing that communities that have promoted preservation have tended to do better economically by, I think, that factor of becoming a community of choice.
I mean, it's probably gettable, but it would be a very, we'll take a commitment to get that happening.
Any researchers in the room, feel free to work with us.
We'll get the resident to do it.
I just have to, I'm sorry to do this, but we have to make a correction. The event on Broadway, the community forum, is 2 weeks from now at 1 o'clock.
Oh, 1 o'clock, I'm sorry.
Not 2 o'clock, 1 o'clock to 3 o'clock in this room.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, it is now noon, so
Yeah,
I
can we get this photo real quick?
Yeah, sure.
Ed, stand over here and I'll get the whole. So this was really a great talk. I knew it would be, and I'm glad we had an audience worthy of our esteemed speaker. And again, please give your regards to Cecil Adams for all of us. It's great stuff. I've got a couple of collections at home. It's a great nightstand of reading. So one quick plug again for our next speaker on March 1st. Keep an eye out for the email on that, on the location, probably here, possibly over at the old Trumbull School at Ashland Foster. That'll be March 1st, and we got Bonnie McDonald, the president of the Landmarks Illinois, coming out. It should be a very compelling program, so I hope we have another great audience like you were today, so thank you very much.